All right, welcome back to the program. I'm going to talk a bit about, maybe an interesting dimension to businesses and fallout in real estate from all of this coronavirus. Many leases have an act of God clause in it. And usually those are, you think of tornadoes or hurricanes or an earthquake or something like that as a way to close out a lease because you can't do operations in the facility. But does a pandemic count? And it sounds like this may be something courts are going to be starting to take up as more and more businesses use that clause to perhaps get out of a lease or not pay a payment and such. I have a legal expert, Quentin Brogdon, with me. He is a fellow in the Invitation-Only International Academy of Trial Lawyers and a fellow in the Invitation-Only American College of Trial Lawyers and deals with these sorts of things. So, first of all, thanks for coming on. And I guess that's my question. Is a pandemic an act of God? I guess this is something the courts are going to start to have to decide.
Hello, Todd. You're right. Contracts often have so-called act of God, and sometimes they're referred to as force majeure, a French word meaning superior force clauses. They're pretty routine in contracts, and they generally spell out extraordinary circumstances that will excuse one or both of the parties from having to perform the obligations under the contract. Generally, when they're in contracts, they spell out things such as war, rioting, terrorism, or governmental laws or regulations that change somehow and prevent the performance of a contract. Most contracts do not explicitly and specifically list epidemics and pandemics as explicit excuses under these act of God or so-called force majeure clauses. The question is whether somehow they can be bootstrapped in, even if they're not explicitly listed, perhaps as some kind of outgrowth. The governmental regulations obviously are shutting down businesses, and there are also catch-all provisions. So it's going to be a case-by-case, fact-specific analysis.
Have you heard of businesses, and I guess it kind of goes both ways, even landlords or tenants that are trying to use this clause at all?
Absolutely. It is already starting to be litigated in courtrooms, and letters are going back and forth. Landlords and tenants and other suppliers and manufacturers, who can't comply because of the virus or shutdowns, growing out of the virus. It's really a very fact-specific analysis, and by that I mean it depends upon the language of the contract. People can contract in any way they want. They can draw up their contracts in any way they want. So what does the contract specifically say? What is the specific contractual obligation that, a party is trying to get out of? And then how specifically did COVID-19 impact the party's ability to meet their contractual relationships? And finally, what law? Most insurance is governed by the specific state in which the transaction is occurring. Insurance law generally is state-specific, so there are commonalities among the 50 states, but there are also differences. So you could have one outcome in one state and another outcome in a different state, depending on what law applies.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah, your State Farm insurance claim is going to be a lot different in Oklahoma than it is here in Washington State, for example.
That's right. That's exactly right.
For a consumer out there, we talked a bit about what the commercial side of things are, but for a consumer, you bring up a good point. If I've lost my job, I can't afford to pay my premium. Is there a case for me?
Well, when you say your premium, you're talking about your insurance premium?
For example, I'm just using that because that tends to be, I think, the big contract most people do, that or a mortgage.
Well, it depends on how your mortgage is written up, and it depends upon whether in your state or in your municipality there's some kind of forgiveness that perhaps trumps what's in the contract that says, for example, you cannot foreclose on homes without, a certain number of weeks or months passing. Many jurisdictions in the wake of COVID-19 have enacted either regulations or governmental decrees that are preventing that. But barring something written into the contract or the government stepping in specifically and saying we're excusing this at least for a month or two, then you owe the premium. People lose their jobs for different reasons, and the loss of a job generally in and of itself does not excuse the contractual obligation, whether we agree that should be the case or not.
It's very interesting. Now, as somebody who watches this stuff, I mean, who would have thunk this, I guess, even a couple of months ago, right, that we'd be talking about a pandemic and how it might affect contract law right now?
That's right. In the wake of 9/11, there was a lot of litigation about terrorism, and after that, contracts evolved and became a lot more explicit so that it wouldn't be ambiguous in the future if we had another, heaven forbid, terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11. Then the contracts, and basically insurance policies are just fancy, it's a specialized type of contract. Then the contracts, and also the contracts between parties for delivery of goods, they have a lot more explicit provisions in them now in the wake of 9/11 about terrorism. My prediction is in the wake of this, in the months and years going forward, contracts and insurance policies will become much more explicit about epidemics and pandemics.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, if you went back 25, 30 years ago and you read that the acts of God, that was all it said in the clause, basically. It was kind of just known as some sort of a weather or a natural event.
That's right, and it has evolved. Yeah. We're sort of always litigating the last set of lawsuits, in a sense, and we try and contract around that so that, when this happens again or something like it, again, heaven forbid, then we won't have to be wondering or worrying. There won't be ambiguities. The parties will have contracted ahead of time to decide who bears the risk.
Now, a couple of things. I mean, there's just this huge impact. We have a terrorist attack. God forbid we have another one. It usually affects one area of a country, for example, not the whole country. This is unknown territory. How do you think that's going to play out as some of these things go through the court system?
Well, it puts a dilemma in the hands of the courts because, law has a concept of foreseeability and risk allocation, and the parties are presumed to have understood the risks and to have allocated them, and then have priced the transaction according to the allocation of that risk. I can allocate risk any way I want to. I can put all the risk on you or all the risk on me, and the price of the transaction will reflect that. Here we have a situation where you could reasonably say neither party could have anticipated or should have anticipated a shutdown of this scale. It hasn't happened in over 100 years. And so that there's a problem. Who was determined to bear this risk? Was it even decided? Was it even contemplated in any sense of the word? You could argue not.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's going to be success in bootstrapping some of this pandemic into the language of the law was changed on me, the rules were changed and it affected my business?
Well, often what happens is courts are faced with, and maybe they don't want to admit they're doing this, the allocation of losses. And there's a whole theory of law that basically says our law evolved, whether we want to admit it or not, largely based on allocations of losses. Who is in the best position to bear this loss, whether it's a railroad car running over an individual and killing them or whatever it may be in the law. And so my prediction is, sort of at a macro level, is that courts will be allocating the loss largely based on who is in the best position to bear it. And then the government's going to step in, I think, and say, we will cover certain losses because none of the parties could have foreseen this, and this is of such a magnitude that we have to step in and in essence, trump what's going on, what the law otherwise would have dictated to have occurred.
That's interesting dynamics in the legal world heading forward. As a consumer, and maybe as somebody who might own a business out there, what's your advice for someone right now?
Well, my advice is to be very careful in just saying force majeure or act of God prevents me from doing this, because if you send a letter or a notice that, hey, I cannot comply, and I'm telling you now, I'm just not going to comply with these terms and provisions, that can be construed under the law as anticipatory repudiation, meaning you're saying before your time comes to have to do something under the contract, you're saying, I'm not going to be doing that 1 week from now. And once under the law you have anticipatorily repudiated a contract, the other party, the party that's innocent, can say, oh, you have repudiated this contract, so you have, in essence, I'm treating this as a breach So I can shut this contract down. I don't have to do what I was going to have to do under the contract because you have told me in advance you're not honoring your obligations under the contract. You have repudiated the contract. So you have to be very careful how you draft any letters or notices you send, even if you think there's a chance you're not going to be able to comply. Once you say, I'm not complying, be aware you may have started a chain of events, even if only unintentionally, that you cannot put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak.
Yeah, it sounds to me like a lot of things right now. Maybe best call up your supplier, your vendor, whatever you have a contract with, and maybe just chat with them about, hey, what is there a way we can make a deal here somehow? Because these are uncertain times, certainly. So, all right, cbrlawfirm.com is the website that you can find Quentin Brogdon. And thanks for coming on. It's very interesting. This will be very curious to see how these play out over the next. And I think we'll be talking about these well after the pandemic is done too.
That's right, Todd. This is going to play out for months, if not years. That's right, Todd. This is going to play out for months, if not years.